Somewhere over the Solomon Islands, in the summer of 1943, Japanese Zero pilots began hearing something they had never heard before. It was not the deep growl of an American engine. It was not the rattle of machine gun fire. It was a sound unlike anything in the skies of the Pacific, a high, sharp whistle, rising in pitch as the thing that made it dove toward them at over 400 miles per hour. They would look up. What they saw was an aircraft with bent wings, cranked downward like the wings of an inverted gull, plunging out of the sun at a speed no Allied fighter had ever reached before. The whistling grew louder, filling the cockpit, filling the sky. And then the 6 heavy machine guns opened fire. That sound would become one of the most feared noises of the Pacific War. Allied troops heard it and cheered. Japanese troops heard it and ran for cover. American Marines called it the bent-wing bird. They called it the hog. They called it the sweetheart of Okinawa. But the name that stuck, the name that has echoed through 8 decades of aviation history, was Whistling Death. This is the story of the Vought F4U Corsair, the fighter plane that was rejected by its own navy, nearly killed the pilots who flew it, and then went on to become the most dominant American fighter of the Pacific War. It is the story of how a sound, a simple aerodynamic accident, became a weapon of terror. And it is the story of the men who flew this extraordinary machine into combat, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the skies over Tokyo. The story of the Corsair begins not in the Pacific, but in a drafting room in Stratford, Connecticut, in 1938. The United States Navy had issued a request to aircraft manufacturers across the country. They wanted a new carrier-based fighter, one that could reach at least 350 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. It was an ambitious target. No carrier fighter in the world could do that in 1938. Most naval fighters of the era topped out below 300 miles per hour and were considered adequate for the job. At the Vought Aircraft Division, Chief Engineer Rex Beisel assembled a team that included project engineer Frank Albright and aerodynamicist Paul Baker. They faced a fundamental engineering problem. To achieve the speed the Navy demanded, they needed the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This was an 18-cylinder, twin-row, air-cooled radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was a beast of a power plant. But it required the largest propeller ever fitted to a fighter aircraft, a Hamilton Standard hydromatic unit measuring 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter. And here was the dilemma. A propeller that large needed enormous clearance from the ground, especially on a carrier deck where space was measured in inches. A conventional straight-wing design would have required landing gear so tall and so heavy that the aircraft would become dangerously unstable during takeoff and landing. The gear legs would be too long, too fragile, too likely to collapse under the stresses of a carrier deck impact. Beisel's solution was elegant and radical. He designed an inverted gull wing, a wing that curved downward at the root before sweeping back upward at the tips. This allowed the main landing gear to be mounted at the wing's lowest point, keeping the gear legs short and strong. When retracted, the gear swiveled 90 degrees and folded straight back into the wing, perfectly flush with the surface. The wing root junction also joined the fuselage at nearly a right angle, which reduced aerodynamic interference drag and made the whole aircraft cleaner and faster. But this brilliant solution created an unintended consequence that no one at Vought anticipated. The engineers needed to cool the massive engine, and to preserve the aerodynamic cleanliness of the aircraft, they placed the oil cooler and intercooler air inlets inside the leading edges of the wing roots, right where the inverted gull wing met the fuselage. These inlets were essentially elongated slots, narrow openings that channeled air into the cooling system. At high speed, air rushing through these slots created a resonance effect, something like air blowing across the mouth of a bottle. The result was a distinctive, high-pitched whistle that was completely unique to the Corsair. No other aircraft in the war made a sound like it. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Lyman Bullard took the prototype, designated XF4U-1, into the air for the first time from Bridgeport Municipal Airport. The flight was a success. The aircraft handled well at altitude and showed immediately that it was fast, far faster than anything the Navy had flown before. In subsequent testing that October, the prototype achieved a ground speed of 405 miles per hour on a timed run between Stratford and Hartford, making it the first American single-engine fighter to credibly approach the 400-mile-per-hour barrier. The Navy was impressed. On June 30, 1941, they placed a production contract for 584 aircraft. The name chosen was Corsair, borrowed from Vaught's earlier 1920s biplane Scout series. The finished production aircraft was a formidable machine by any standard. It measured 33 feet and 4 inches in length, with a wingspan of 40 feet and nearly 12 inches. It weighed roughly 9,000 pounds empty, and could gross up to 14,000 pounds when fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and external ordnance. Its fuel system included a 237-gallon self-sealing fuselage tank, and early variants also carried additional fuel in wing leading-edge cells. The armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns gave it one of the heaviest gun batteries of any single-engine fighter in the war. Each gun was fed by a belt of 400 rounds for the inner pair and 375 rounds for the outer pairs, giving the pilot a sustained firing time that could last for several engagements before running dry. Later variants would add the option of 4 20mm cannon for even greater hitting power. But transforming the prototype into a production fighter created a cascade of problems that nearly killed the entire program. The heavy wing-mounted guns displaced the original wing fuel tanks. Those tanks had to be relocated to a large fuselage tank mounted ahead of the cockpit. To accommodate this, the cockpit was pushed back 32 inches. The pilot now sat far behind a nose that stretched more than 14 feet ahead of him. In the three-point landing attitude required for carrier operations, he could see virtually nothing straight ahead. The landing signal officer on a carrier deck was invisible to him at the most critical moment of flight. The problems did not stop there. The powerful engine torque and the massive propeller's slipstream created an asymmetric airflow over the wings. At approach speeds, the left wing would stall before the right, dropping suddenly with almost no warning. This was terrifying at altitude. Near a carrier deck, it was lethal. The main landing gear's shock-absorbing struts were too stiff, causing the aircraft to bounce violently on touchdown, often sending it right over the arresting wires and into the aircraft parked forward. Oil and hydraulic fluid leaked from the cowl flaps and streamed back across the windscreen, further blinding the pilot during approach. Carrier qualification trials in 1942, aboard several escort carriers, confirmed what test pilots already knew. The Corsair was a death trap on a carrier deck. Navy pilots gave it bitter nicknames. They called it the Hog for its heavy nose-down appearance on the ground. They called it the Hose Nose for its absurdly long engine cowling. They called it the Bent Wing Widowmaker. And worst of all, they called it the Ensign Eliminator, because at training bases like Marine Corps Air Station Mojave, young pilots were dying at an alarming rate, trying to learn how to fly it. The Navy made a decision that seemed at the time like a death sentence for the aircraft. They rejected the Corsair for carrier operations, and instead pushed the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which used the same R-2800 engine, as their primary carrier fighter. The Hellcat was slower and less capable in many respects, but it was docile, forgiving, and easy to land on a pitching deck. The Corsair was handed over to the United States Marine Corps for land-based operations, where its dangerous landing characteristics would be less of an issue on long, fixed runways. It was a decision born of necessity. But it would place the Corsair in exactly the right hands, because the Marines would take this rejected, problematic, dangerous machine and turn it into the most feared fighter in the Pacific. To understand what the Corsair was flying into, you have to understand the state of the Pacific War in early 1943. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had turned the tide, costing Japan 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement. But the war was far from over. The campaign for Guadalcanal, which had begun in August 1942, was still grinding on. American Marines and Army troops held the island, but Japanese forces on surrounding islands and bases to the north, particularly the massive fortress complex at Rabaul on New Britain, continued to launch air attacks almost daily. The skies over the Solomon Islands were among the most contested airspace on Earth. The fighters defending Guadalcanal in those early months were a mixed force of Marine Wildcats, Army P-38s and P-40s, and a handful of Navy aircraft. They were outnumbered. They were often outperformed by the nimble Japanese Zero, and they were exhausted. The airfield at Henderson Field was little more than a scraped coral strip surrounded by jungle, subject to constant shelling and bombing. Pilots slept in muddy tents, ate canned rations, and flew multiple missions a day in tropical heat that left them drenched in sweat before they even reached altitude. Malaria was almost as dangerous as the Japanese. Into this environment came the Corsair. It arrived not with fanfare but with skepticism. The Marines who would fly it had heard the stories from stateside, the crashes, the deaths, and the Navy's rejection, but they also knew what the aircraft could do. It was faster than anything else in the Pacific. It climbed better than any American fighter, except at very low speeds. And its 6 heavy machine guns could shred a Japanese aircraft in a single, well-aimed burst, pouring out nearly 5,000 rounds per minute of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. On February 12, 1943, 12 Corsairs of Marine Fighting Squadron 124 arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The squadron was commanded by Major William Edward Guise. These were the first Corsairs to reach a combat zone, and their pilots were eager but untested in this particular aircraft. They flew their first mission that same afternoon, a patrol and rescue escort to Vella La Vella. No enemy aircraft were encountered. The men were relieved and disappointed in equal measure. 2 days later, on February 14th, they got their first real test. 12 Corsairs from VMF 124 joined 10 P-38s from the Army Air Forces and escorted a formation of PB-4Y Liberator bombers on a strike against the Japanese airfield at Kahili on Bougainville. Approximately 40 Zeros and floatplane fighters from the 252nd, 204th, and 802nd Kokutai intercepted the formation. What followed was a disaster. The Americans lost 2 Corsairs, several P-38s, and 2 bombers. American pilots claimed 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, but Japanese records confirmed the loss of only a single Zero, whose pilot collided with one of the Corsairs in a mid-air impact that killed both men. The mission was immediately nicknamed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was a humbling, painful debut. But the fault was not in the aircraft. It was in the tactics. The American pilots had tried to fight the Zero on its own terms, turning and maneuvering at medium and low speeds where the lightweight Japanese fighter was virtually unbeatable. They had not yet learned the cardinal rule that would define Corsair combat for the rest of the war. That rule was articulated by a Marine pilot named Kenneth Walsh, who would become the first man to achieve ace status in a Corsair. Walsh, flying with VMF 124, understood the aircraft's strengths better than almost anyone. He later explained the key principle. The F4U could outperform a Zero in every aspect except slow speed maneuverability and slow speed rate of climb. Therefore, you avoided getting slow when combating a Zero. The answer was energy fighting. Altitude was paramount. You dove on the enemy from above, used the Corsair's superior speed and roll rate to make a firing pass, and then zoomed back up to altitude before the Zero could turn to engage. You never, ever entered a turning fight. If a Zero got on your tail, you dove away. The Corsair could outdive any Japanese fighter by a wide margin. At high speed, its controls remained effective, while the Zeros grew heavy and sluggish. The battle was won not by who could turn tighter, but by who controlled the energy state of the engagement. The technical comparison between the two aircraft told the story clearly. The A6M50, the variant Corsair pilots most commonly faced, weighed roughly 6,000 pounds fully loaded. The Corsair weighed more than 12,000. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks, sacrifices that the Japanese designers had made deliberately to maximize range and maneuverability. The Corsair, by contrast, had armor plate behind the pilot's seat and head and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb hits without igniting. A Zero that took a burst of 50 caliber fire often exploded. A Corsair could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. This survivability advantage mattered enormously over the course of a long campaign. Even if a Corsair pilot was hit, he had a good chance of making it home. A Zero pilot who took a solid burst rarely had that luxury. The Corsair's top speed advantage was equally decisive. At 20,000 feet, the Corsair could reach 417 miles per hour. The A6M50, the most common late-war variant, topped out at 351. That 66-mile-per-hour speed advantage meant that the Corsair pilot could choose when to fight and when to disengage. If the situation was unfavorable, he simply pushed the throttle forward and left the fight. The Zero could not follow. This ability to control the terms of engagement was perhaps the single most important tactical advantage any fighter could have. Walsh did not merely preach this doctrine, he proved it in the most dramatic fashion possible. On August 15, 1943, over Vella La Vella in the Solomon Islands, Walsh's division was badly outnumbered by a mixed force of Japanese dive bombers and escorting fighters. He had altitude and speed. Using disciplined diving attacks, he shot down 3 enemy aircraft before disengaging. 2 weeks later, on August 30th, he did it again. Separated from his escort over Kahili, Walsh found himself alone against approximately 50 Japanese aircraft. He engaged them single-handedly, destroying 4 more before being shot down himself. He survived, was rescued from the water, and continued flying combat missions. For these 2 engagements, Walsh received the Medal of Honor, the first Corsair pilot to earn the nation's highest military decoration. He finished the war with 21 confirmed victories, 17 of them zeros. By the autumn of 1943, the Corsair was no longer a problem aircraft being flown by frustrated Marines. It was becoming the most lethal fighter in the Pacific theater, and its most famous pilot was about to arrive on the scene. Major Gregory Boyington was 31 years old when he took command of Marine Fighting Squadron 214 in mid-August 1943 at Espiritu Santo. He was an unlikely hero. A former flying tiger who had flown with the American volunteer group in China and Burma, Boyington was a hard, drinking, brawling, insubordinate officer who had resigned his Marine commission to avoid a looming court-martial before joining the Flying Tigers and who had struggled with alcoholism throughout his career. The Marine Corps considered him a problem, but they also recognized that he was an extraordinarily skilled pilot with combat experience that most of his contemporaries lacked. VMF 214 was itself an unlikely unit. It was assembled from replacement pilots who had been left behind when their original squadrons rotated home, men without a squadron and without a mission. They called themselves the Black Sheep, and the name stuck. Under Boyington's aggressive leadership, the Black Sheep became one of the most effective fighter squadrons in the Pacific. Boyington led from the front, always. He flew at the head of every mission, challenging his pilots to match his aggressiveness and his skill. His leadership style was unconventional. He drank heavily, argued with superior officers, and ran his squadron more like a pirate crew than a military unit. But in the air, his judgment was superb. He taught his pilots the same energy fighting tactics that Walsh had pioneered, insisting that altitude and speed were everything, that you never, ever got slow with a Japanese fighter on your tail. He demanded discipline in the air, even as he flouted regulations on the ground, and his pilots responded. They idolized him, not because he was polished or proper, but because he was fearless and because he brought them home alive. In roughly 12 weeks of combat flying between September 1943 and January 1944, VMF 214 was credited with 97 enemy aircraft destroyed and 35 probables, producing 9 aces among its 27 pilots. Boyington himself claimed 22 kills during this period, added to 6 he claimed from his Flying Tiger days, though only 2 of those earlier victories were confirmed by the American Volunteer Group's records. His official total of 28 broke the American record of 26 victories held by Captain Eddie Rickenbacker from the First World War. On January 3, 1944, over Rabaul, Boyington's war came to a sudden end. During a large dogfight, his Corsair was hit, and he was forced to bail out over the sea. His wingman, Captain George Ashman, was killed in the same engagement. Boyington was pulled from the water by a Japanese submarine and spent the remaining 20 months of the war as a prisoner. He endured beatings, starvation, and interrogation, but survived. When he was liberated from Omori prison camp on August 29, 1945, the Marine Corps awarded him the Medal of Honor, which had originally been issued as a posthumous decoration because he had been listed as killed in action. While Boyington captured the public imagination, other Corsair pilots were compiling combat records that were equally remarkable. First, Lieutenant Robert Hanson of VMF 215, nicknamed Butcher Bob, achieved something that no other Corsair pilot matched before or after. In January 1944, Hanson shot down 20 enemy aircraft in just 17 consecutive flying days. On January 14th alone, he destroyed 5 Zeros in a single mission. On January 24th, he got 4 more. On the 26th, another 3. His total reached 25 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring Corsair ace of the entire war. Hanson's extraordinary run ended on February 3, 1944, the day before his 24th birthday. While strafing a Japanese-held lighthouse at Cape St. George on New Ireland, his Corsair clipped the water at low altitude. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. Hanson was killed instantly. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, and the United States Navy named the destroyer USS Hanson in his honor. In the Navy, the story was no less impressive. Lieutenant Junior Grade Ira Kepford of Fighter Squadron 17, the Jolly Rogers, scored 16 confirmed kills in just 76 days of combat flying between November 1943 and April 1944. On February 19, 1944, Kepford single-handedly escaped from 3 zeros over Rabaul, nursing his damaged Corsair back to base riddled with bullet holes, by some accounts more than 100. Fighter Squadron 17 itself was credited with 152 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed during its Corsair tours, producing 11 aces. The cumulative statistics told a story of dominance that was difficult to argue with. By the end of the war, Corsair pilots claimed 2,140 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, while losing 189 of their own, a ratio of better than 11 to 1. These were American claimed figures and almost certainly involved some degree of overclaiming, as was common on all sides during the war. But even accounting for that, the Corsair's record was extraordinary. But the Corsair's contribution to the war went far beyond air-to-air combat. As the Pacific Campaign progressed, and Japanese air power was steadily ground down, the Corsair increasingly took on the role of fighter bomber and close air support aircraft. It proved brilliantly suited to this mission. The same structural strength that made it a devastating diving fighter also allowed it to carry heavy bomb loads. Late war Corsairs could haul up to 4,000 pounds of ordnance on maximum demonstrated loads, including general-purpose bombs, napalm canisters, and 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. By the end of the war, Corsairs had delivered an estimated 15,621 tons of bombs, roughly 70% of all fighter dropped bomb tonnage in the entire Pacific theater. During the island-hopping campaigns across the Central and Western Pacific, Marine Corsair squadrons flew in direct support of ground troops hitting beaches on Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They strafed Japanese bunkers and gun positions at treetop level. They dropped napalm on fortified positions that could not be reached by conventional bombing. They flew so close to friendly lines that infantry could sometimes see the pilots' faces as they pulled up from their runs. The Marines on the ground came to depend on the Corsair the way earlier generations of soldiers had depended on artillery. When the bent wings appeared overhead, the men on the ground knew that help had arrived. Meanwhile, across the world, the problem that had haunted the Corsair since its birth was being solved, and the solution came not from America, but from Britain. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm had received Corsairs beginning in mid-1943. British carriers had lower hangar ceilings than American ones, so the wingtips had to be clipped by 8 inches to fit. But the real breakthrough was operational, not structural. British pilots, who had hard-won experience with the long-nosed and notoriously difficult-to-land Supermarine Seafire, developed a technique that transformed the Corsair from a carrier killer into a carrier fighter. Instead of flying a straight approach to the deck, as American procedures demanded, the Fleet Air Arm pilots flew a continuous curving approach, banking gently to the left throughout the final descent. This kept both the carrier deck and the landing signal officer visible over the low-wing route throughout the approach. The pilot never lost sight of the ship. In addition to the curved approach, the British made several practical modifications. They wired the top cowl flaps shut to prevent oil from streaming onto the windscreen. They raised the pilot's seat by 7 inches and fitted a bulged canopy to improve visibility. They lengthened the tailwheel strut for better ground handling, and they added a small spoiler strip to the leading edge of the right wing so that both wings would stall symmetrically instead of the left dropping first. On June 1, 1943, the Fleet Air Arm's 1830 Naval Air Squadron was commissioned and assigned to HMS Illustrious, becoming the first British unit to begin operating Corsairs for carrier service. This was more than 10 months before the United States Navy would finally clear the type for its own carrier operations in April 1944. The British had taken the aircraft that the American Navy rejected and made it work at sea. It was an achievement that remains underappreciated in most accounts of the war. When the American Navy finally adopted the British techniques and incorporated Vaught's own engineering fixes, including the longer landing gear strut, the stall strip, the raised seat, and the bubble canopy that replaced the earlier framed cockpit enclosure, the Corsair became a fully capable carrier aircraft. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945, Corsairs were flying from American fleet carriers as both fighters and fighter bombers. They played a critical role in defending the fleet against Japanese kamikaze attacks, intercepting suicide aircraft before they could reach the ships. The kamikaze threat was unlike anything the Navy had faced before. Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American warships, and even a single hit could sink a destroyer or cripple a carrier. The Corsair's speed and climb rate made it the ideal interceptor for this role. Corsair pilots on combat air patrol could scramble to altitude quickly, identify incoming kamikazes at maximum range, and engage them before they reached the fleet. Day after day, mission after mission, Corsair pilots hurled themselves at formations of suicide aircraft, shooting them down one by one, often at close range, often taking hits from debris as their targets disintegrated in front of them. Marines on the ground called the Corsair the Angel of Okinawa. Sailors on the ships below had their own gratitude. The Corsair had come full circle from rejection to redemption. But what of the Japanese perspective? What did the men on the receiving end actually think of this aircraft? The most famous Japanese assessment comes from Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, who wrote about the Corsair in his memoir. Sakai regarded the Corsair as among the most formidable Allied fighters he faced in the Pacific War. His assessment carried weight. Sakai had been credited with dozens of aerial victories, had fought from the first day of the war to the last, and had survived being grievously wounded over Guadalcanal in August 1942, a wound that permanently blinded him in one eye. When a pilot of that caliber said an aircraft was dangerous, other pilots listened. Japanese pilots quickly learned that the Corsair could outclimb, outdive, and outrun the A6M0 at virtually every altitude. The Zero retained an advantage only at very low speeds in tight horizontal turns. But American pilots, following the doctrine that Walsh and others had developed, simply refused to fight on those terms. The frustration for Japanese pilots was immense. They could see the enemy. They could try to engage, but the Americans chose when to fight and when to break off, and there was nothing the Japanese could do about it. A Zero pilot who tried to chase a diving Corsair would find his controls stiffening, his airframe shuddering, and his quarry pulling steadily away. The situation grew worse as the war progressed. By 1944, the experienced Japanese pilots who had dominated the early years of the war were dying faster than they could be replaced. The training pipeline that had once produced superb aviators over a period of years was now pushing poorly trained replacements through abbreviated courses lasting only a few months. These young pilots were sent into combat against seasoned American veterans flying aircraft that were superior in nearly every measurable way. The results were predictable and devastating. In the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944, Japanese naval aviation suffered losses so catastrophic that it never recovered as an effective fighting force. As for the name Whistling Death, the historical record requires honesty. While the nickname has been repeated in countless books, documentaries, and museum displays as a term used by the Japanese themselves, surviving Japanese wartime records do not actually support this attribution. Japanese pilots and military documents generally referred to the Corsair simply as the Sikorsky, after the Vought Sikorsky corporate name that appeared on the manufacturer's plate. The whistle itself was absolutely real. You can still hear it today when surviving Corsairs perform diving passes at air shows around the world. That eerie, rising sound as air rushes through the wing root inlets is unmistakable. But the poetic name, Whistling Death, appears to have originated on the Allied side of the war, and was attributed to the Japanese as the legend grew. It captures something true about the aircraft, its sound, its speed, its lethality, even if the exact origin of the phrase is more complicated than the simple story usually told. What is not disputed is that the Japanese feared the Corsair. By late 1944 and into 1945, Japan was fielding newer, more capable fighters. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate and the Kawanishi N-1 Keishiden Kai, aircraft that were on paper much closer to the Corsair in raw performance than the aging Zero. But by this point in the war, Japan's greatest weakness was not its aircraft, but its pilots. The catastrophic losses of experienced aviators during 1943 and 44 at Guadalcanal, at Rabaul, in the Marianas Turkey Chute, had hollowed out the Japanese air forces. The men flying these newer, more capable machines increasingly lacked the training and experience to use them effectively. Manufacturing quality was also declining, as American bombing campaigns devastated Japanese industry. Engines that should have produced peak horsepower ran rough and failed prematurely. Airframes that should have been precise were built with wartime shortcuts that reduced their performance. The Corsair's dominance was not just about the aircraft, it was about the entire system, a superior airplane, flown by well-trained pilots, maintained by skilled ground crews, supported by an industrial base that could produce aircraft and spare parts in quantities that Japan could never match. This was the reality behind the numbers, behind the 11-to-1 ratio, behind the legend. When the war ended in August 1945, most expected the Corsair to retire alongside the conflict that made it famous. Instead, it kept flying and kept fighting. The Corsair's war did not end with Japan's surrender. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the Corsair was called back into action. Marine and Navy squadrons flew the F4U4 and the later F4U5 variants in close air support and ground attack missions across the Korean peninsula. The aircraft proved devastatingly effective in this role, carrying bombs, rockets, and napalm against North Korean and Chinese positions. 5 years after the end of World War II, the Corsair was once again proving that it was one of the finest ground attack aircraft ever built. Its ability to carry heavy ordnance, absorb ground fire, and loiter over the battlefield for extended periods made it indispensable to the troops fighting below. At the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950, during one of the most desperate battles in Marine Corps history, Corsairs provided constant close air support to surrounded Marines fighting their way out of a Chinese encirclement. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Weapons froze. Vehicles would not start. But overhead, Corsair pilots flew mission after mission, sometimes making gun and bomb runs within 50 yards of friendly positions. The Marines on the ground could hear the whistle of the Corsairs as they dove in, followed by the thud of explosions and the rattle of 50 caliber fire tearing into Chinese positions. For the men of the 1st Marine Division, fighting their way down a frozen road from Udamni to Hungnam with Chinese forces on every ridge, those bent wings overhead were often the difference between survival and annihilation. It was during this campaign that one of the most remarkable acts of valor in naval aviation history took place. On December 4, 1950, Ensign Jesse Brown of Fighter Squadron 32 became the first African-American naval aviator to be killed in combat when his Corsair was hit by ground fire and crash-landed near the reservoir. His squadron mate, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Hudner, deliberately crash-landed his own Corsair nearby in an attempt to rescue Brown from the burning wreckage. Brown did not survive, but Hudner's selfless act earned him the Medal of Honor. The Corsair even scored aerial victories in Korea. Marine Captain Jesse Folmer, of VMA 312, shot down a Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighter with his Corsair's 20mm cannons on September 10, 1952, before being shot down himself by other MiGs. He was rescued from the sea. And Lieutenant Guy Bordelon of the Navy became the only American all-piston engine ace of the Korean War, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft, 3 Soviet-built Lavochkin fighters, and 2 Yakovlev trainers being used as night harassment bombers, all while flying an F4U-5N night fighter variant. After Korea, the Corsair's combat career continued in the hands of other nations. The French Navy, the Aéronavale, operated 163 Corsairs in some of the most intense colonial conflicts of the post-war era. French Corsairs flew combat missions over Indochina in 1954, including during the final desperate weeks of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. French pilots flew 959 sorties over the course of the campaign, with 2 Corsairs shot down and 6 more damaged. After Indochina, French Corsairs fought in the Algerian War, participated in the Anglo-French Suez operation in November 1956, striking Egyptian airfields from the decks of French carriers, and flew combat missions during the Bizerte crisis in Tunisia in 1961. The last French Corsairs were not withdrawn from service until September 1964. But the most extraordinary final chapter of the Corsairs' combat story came in Central America in July 1969, during the brief but violent conflict between Honduras and El Salvador, known as the Football War. On July 17th, Honduran Air Force Captain Fernando Soto, flying an F4U-5NL Corsair, shot down a Salvadoran P-51 Mustang in the morning. That afternoon, Soto engaged and destroyed two Salvadoran Corsairs, FG-1D models that had originally been built by Goodyear during World War II. These were the last confirmed air-to-air kills between piston-engine fighters in history. The era that had begun with canvas biplanes over the trenches of France in 1914 ended with bent-wing Corsairs over the jungles of Central America in 1969. In total, 12,571 Corsairs were built between 1942 and January 31st. 1953. When the last F4U-7 rolled off the production line for the French Navy, they were manufactured by three companies: Vought, Goodyear, under the designation FG, and Brewster, under the designation F3A. The Brewster line was eventually shut down due to quality control problems, but the Vought and Goodyear factories kept the aircraft flowing to frontline units in enormous numbers throughout the war and beyond. The production run spanned more than a decade, making the Corsair the longest-produced piston-engine fighter in American history. No other American single-engine fighter came close to that record. Today, approximately 120 complete Corsair airframes survive worldwide. Of those, roughly 38 remain in flying condition. The oldest airworthy example is a Corsair, held by the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California, an F4U-1A that was built during the war and restored to flying condition in 1975. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum displays a Corsair at the Udvar-Hazy Center near Washington. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, holds a recovered early model that was pulled from the bottom of Lake Michigan, where it had been lost during carrier qualification training in the 1940s. In England, the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton preserves a Goodyear-built example, a quiet reminder of the role that British pilots played in making the Corsair a carrier fighter. And in Honduras, the Museo del Aire displays Captain Fernando Soto's personal aircraft, the Corsair that scored the last piston-engine aerial victories in history. The Corsair's influence extended beyond the battlefield and into popular culture. In 1976, the American television series about Boyington and the Black Sheep Squadron brought the Corsair to a new generation. The show used 8 surviving Corsairs for filming, putting the distinctive bent-wing silhouette on television screens across the country. Decades later, the 2022 film Devotion told the story of Thomas Hudner and Jesse Brown, bringing the Korean War chapter of the Corsair's service to the big screen. The state of Connecticut, where the Corsair was designed and first built, designated it the official state aircraft in honor of the Vought Sikorsky, Pratt & Whitney, and Hamilton Standard companies that made it possible. Even the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh, flew combat missions in Corsairs with Marine Air Group, 31 in 1944, quietly testing the aircraft in real combat conditions as a civilian technical advisor. At air shows around the world, whenever a surviving Corsair makes a high-speed pass, the crowds hear it, the whistle. That same eerie, rising sound that carried across the skies of the Solomon Islands more than 80 years ago. It is not the sound of an engine. It is not the sound of wind over wings. It is the sound of air being forced through those narrow slots in the wing roots. The cooling inlets that Rex Beisel's engineers designed in a Connecticut factory in 1938, without any idea of the legend they were creating. The Corsair did not begin as a weapon of terror. It began as an engineering problem. How to fit the biggest engine and the biggest propeller onto a carrier deck. The inverted gull wing was the answer. The whistle was an accident, but war has a way of turning accidents into legends. 933 days after the Corsair first saw combat over Guadalcanal, American forces would be standing on the decks of carriers in Tokyo Bay, watching the Japanese surrender ceremony. The Corsair did not win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it earned its place among the machines that shaped the outcome, alongside the Mustang and the Hellcat, the Spitfire and the Thunderbolt, the aircraft that gave Allied pilots the edge they needed to win control of the sky. The men who flew the Corsair came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa, college students from the East Coast, factory workers' sons from the Midwest. They climbed into cockpits that sat behind 14 feet of engine cowling, fought controls that could kill them as easily as the enemy could, and flew into combat against some of the best-trained fighter pilots in the world. Some of them came home with medals and victory marks painted on their fuselages. Some of them came home with nightmares they would carry for the rest of their lives, and some of them never came home at all. Kenneth Walsh survived the war and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1962. Gregory Boyington survived captivity and died in 1988. Robert Hanson lies somewhere in the waters off New Ireland, forever 23 years old. Ira Kepford survived the war and returned to civilian life. Thomas Hoodner, who crashed his own Corsair into the frozen hills of Korea to try to save a friend, lived until 2017, passing away at the age of 93. Their aircraft, the Whistling Death, the Bent-Wing Bird, the Hog, the Angel of Okinawa, was never the easiest plane to fly. It was never the most forgiving. It killed its own pilots nearly as often as the enemy did in those early days. But in the hands of men who understood it, who respected its power and learned to use its strengths, it became something extraordinary. It became the sound that the enemy feared most, a whistle in the sky that meant death was coming, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Today, that sound still echoes, not over combat zones, but over airfields and museums and memorial services, where old men with fading eyes look up at the bent wings passing overhead and remember. They remember the heat of the Pacific, the smell of aviation fuel, the taste of salt spray on their lips. They remember friends who did not come back. They remember the whistle. And as the last of those men pass from living memory into history, the task of remembering falls to us, not to glorify war, but to honor those who served. Not to celebrate destruction, but to understand the courage it took to climb into that cockpit, to hear that whistle, and to fly toward the fight. The Corsair earned its name, every note of it,